really been enjoying Destination Time Travel.
Good.
It's fantastic. And I guess I could say you're also responsible for me every time I saw a mirror as a child trying a different voice. So no, I'm really excited to chat to you.
I've got my own mirror there, which I use a lot, actually, in terms of describing. If I need to describe something, we can talk about this, but if I need to describe an action in the book I'm writing or whatever, I actually stand in front of the mirror just there. It's sort of in there, and do it, and then try to describe it in words.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's kind of like it makes sense, doesn't it? It's like a transferable skill.
Well, it's one of my weaknesses as writing stuff is physical descriptions. But actually, I've just finished, nearly finished. I've got one more chapter to go of Stephen King's book, which is called Dance Macabre, which is about horror stories. And he makes the point that one of the weaknesses of modern writers is their inability to put in words the action that's going on in the story and the action that you want in somebody's head.
So, yeah, I would agree with that. I certainly, when I did screenwriting at university, and I was always drawn to Woody Allen and Kevin Smith and very dialogue heavy. I would write conversation after conversation after conversation, and the thing I found really hard was the bits that really hold that together.
No, and I you're not alone. I find it the most difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
It's certainly not. It's a craft, and my editor of the first book was actually quite good at cutting back the descriptions. But there was one description in the novel, and it was the character lifting up a trunk. And underneath the trunk, there was a split, which was allowing earth to fall out. But he sort of lifted it up and put his knee underneath in order to feel inside. And actually describing all that was incredibly difficult, you know, as a description thing. So and you use too many words, and then the reader gets frustrated because they've got too. Well, you know this, you've written, so it's trying to get few. I loved Stephen King's definition of style, which was use fewer words.
Yeah, concision is something that when I was teaching writing that with the younger children, you know, often there was sort of things that we had to have in a piece of writing, almost like a checklist, which was quite frustrating to kind of balance that with freedom and creativity. You know, and sometimes just saying you don't have to write a lot. It doesn't have to be a lot. You just have to really think about what you're putting in, you know, what the building blocks are, what those, you know, it can be something can be very powerful. A one-word sentence can be very powerful.
Absolutely.
The book that I used to use a lot for that was A Monster Calls. Now, with the children being 11, it may have gone over their head a little bit, but actually the emotion of it and the small subtle differences in the locations and the houses was something that was quite interesting. You know, like how rain can weep down a window. You know, it's things like that kind of I always felt switched them on to writing with that sort of creativity. So yeah, it's fascinating to hear you talk about that as being a challenge, even at your level, which is a lot higher than my level.
Well, I think it's a challenge for everybody, and I suspect that it's Patrick Ness. Is that right? I'm right?
Yeah.
Because I've read a few of his books. I suspect that the very first time he wrote, I can't prove this, but I suspect that the very first time he said the rain streamed down the windows, and I suspect that somewhere in an edit, once he had his theme, which is, you know, bereavement, then then that word we probably came to him and say, oh no, this is a much better word because it fits the theme. But we can talk about all that. I mean, it's
that's fantastic.
And going back to your point about words, I used to teach a screenwriting course in Birmingham about 20 years ago, and I've done many things. And one of the frustrations I had was the students, and nothing wrong with this because of Woody Allen, and they like, Woody Allen movies, which is very dialogue based. But one of the things I was saying in the screenwriting course, they said, when we're going to do dialogue, I said, but that's not a screenplay. You write your screenplay and then you add your dialogue. And I said, no, but I said, no, a screenplay is the story told in visual images and words, but that's not the same. I said, look, you will have cried at these two words, and it's just two words of dialogue, but you need pages of dialogue, pages of screenplay to get there. And they said, well, what are these two words? I said, it's the end of E.T. Come, stay.
Yeah.
And they got it then, because that's all you needed at the end.
Yeah, it's very similar to songwriting, isn't it? You hear of songwriters as they develop their craft, that they can kind of get to the point quicker, because they know the exact words in the exact places, and it's fascinating to see how people develop that, and sometimes, certainly in writing and screenwriting, you see people become, their economy of words does change as their career develop, unless it's a particular signature, like we said, a Tarantino or a Woody Allen or someone like that, where it's almost their signature. But then, even then, I think people forget that within that there is a lot going on.
Oh yeah, and there's a narrative, and Woody Allen tends to write the dialogue in such a way that the actors can change it if they want to. He's not a stickler, and he says, this is, you just do it, and you know what to say. Just do it in your own words. You know what to say. Exactly how you say it is up to you. I mean, that's he gives the actors the freedom to do that. Not to change the story.
That's interesting, because obviously he comes from a comedy background and stand-up, and I was going to introduce you as a time traveler in literacy, and also a man of 1,000 voices. And I was thinking, how do those things link together? But they really do. You've kind of almost said it already when we talked about the getting improvisation in acting and things like that. What do you think is the sort of link between the creativity of being a writer and also being a performer? Like, there seems to be a lot of people say, actors and writers, they tend to go on and be directors. You don't see many sort of cinematographers go on and become directors as much. What have you always been writing down ideas and then performing them because you're the best person to perform your ideas?
Well, I think with the connection between performing and writing is as a performer and as an actor, you're understanding how characters work, different characters, different speech patterns, different type of language, and so on, and sort of once you understand that, if you're able to then reproduce that in writing, you've got a natural understanding that all characters speak differently, and many writers that just write and don't perform don't always get different voices for their characters. So by definition, an actor that's used to playing different voices, or a voice actor more like myself, you develop an instinctive understanding of different speech patterns, different use of language, and you apply that, and it's so the mimesis, or the imitation, as it were, then comes into the writing. You mentioned cinematography. I have zero visual skills at all. I'm not an artist. I draw a little bit, but I'm not very good, and so I don't have any visual skills, and I wouldn't make a very good director from that point of view. I might make a reasonable director in terms of storytelling, because I've always wanted to write stories, and there's a very good friend of mine, sadly no longer with us, called Phil Eason, and I see you've on the thing you've got Muppet Treasure Island and so on there. Well, Phil and I worked on Dark Crystal recently, the new television series, and I gave him my book to read, The Swidgers, and he was very kind about it, and he liked it. And he was the person who encouraged me to write. And he said, "Steve, you should be writing." I said, "I'm not a particularly good writer." He said, "You're a good storyteller, and that's much harder."
Yes.
And I sort of think what I do is storytelling. I fix the writing. The writing's not great, but I fix it in later edits. It's the story. It's story information, where you put that information. That's the key to me.
I understand that, because looking through, and we'll talk a bit about the Swidgers more later, but looking through the Swidgers and even more of a discussion-based book in Destination Time Travel, that there is a strong hook there of you're not struggling for content, is what I'm trying to say, I guess. They're all very much fully realized, or fully you can see that you've had an idea and you have to get it on the page. And I think that stands out.
The comedy side is interesting because and writing, and that to me is economy. So you get a comedian like Jimmy Carr, who basically says, and he's said this a few times, that his entire year is basically writing 200 gags. But the art and the craft is getting the wording of those 200 gags right. And often he'll have an idea for a joke, and there's too many words. And what he said he's constantly doing for each line is honing it down. So the idea is there in the fewest words possible. And I think that's a very good lesson to learn early if you're going to be a comedy writer. And you get that in by doing stand-up, and I did stand-up, and you'd sort of do your stand-up, and then you've written it and you've learnt it, and then you go out and do it. And this is why performers should always record live when they're performing, and then somehow the brain just tells it better than the way you've written it when you're live in front of an audience. And I've worked with many comedians who, when they come off stage and said, "What did I just say? I just said it perfectly."
All it's passed in it, yeah.
And I can't remember. And that's sort of why you should record it, because the brain is constantly trying to make it as good as it can do.
Yeah.
And it's also the reason why actors know good writing and bad writing, because bad writing cannot be learnt because there's too many words. I was a quick story. I was in a play and I couldn't learn the lines, and I said to one of the writers, it was a co-written, I said, "Could we meet on Monday morning before we start rehearsals? Because I think there's a way of doing all these lines more economically." And he was a bit awkward about it and not entirely pleased that I'd asked him this. So and then we met and we spent an hour, and I went through the script with him, and he said, "Steve, that's brilliant. I mean, it's the same idea, but in fewer words, or the fewest possible words." And then he said to me, he said, "I wish I'd done the whole play like that, but I thought the other actor had already learned it." But there was too many. So I when I watch comedy sketch shows, particularly, if there are too many words, you can just feel the awkwardness. And what actors instinctively do is they speed up the words to get it all in, and their instincts are right, but it's the writer's problem. And that's why I learned a lot working with John Lloyd, who produced Spitting Image, because he would have a pencil. He used to have not this pencil obviously, but he used to have a really long pencil at the beginning of the series, and as the series went on, the pencil got more and more short. because he was constantly cutting what words weren't needed in the and kept the comic idea, but with fewer words.
Yeah. I was just wondering, would that tie in with what you were doing as a voice actor as well, in the sense of, as he learned what you brought to a character, whether it was even not necessarily even a word, but a sound, you didn't need as much to get across the point. So, for example, you know, well, I'll just talk about some of my favorites, but I could list hundreds. But you know, someone like I don't know, Ringo Starr or Kenneth Williams or someone like that. There's maybe patterns and sounds that allow the writer to leave a little bit of the explanation out and get straight to the joke.
Yes, I think that's true. And you know, actors, the old actors from sitcoms of the 60s used to say, "Don't give me a line there. Give me a look. I know what to say, but I'll say it with my eyes." That was Danny Nichols in Till Death Us Do Part. You know, she said, "I don't need a line there." She was very, you know, not an easy woman to deal with. She just said, "I don't need a line there. Trust me, I'll give him a look." And that's actually sometimes all that was needed. Sometimes writers, because they like writing and they like the words they write, that they insist that their words be said. And I've worked with writers like that. The other thing about you, going back to Woody Allen, I mean, you can learn a lot from Woody Allen's writing for his stand-up. He didn't do that much of it, but like lots of people, I used to listen to his records. And there's things you learn, like what is known as I think the technical term is a periodic sentence, and that is the most important word you keep to the end of the sentence. And you do not repeat in the gag line a word that was previously used in the setup. Obviously, you have to.
So that's real mechanics, isn't it? That's
there has to be one word in the key word in the gag must not have been used previously, because the whole point is it's a gag and it's a surprise. And if that word has been previously used, you've heard it, and it must come as a surprise. And ideally, in a periodic sentence, you put the whatever the key word is at the end of the sentence. And Alan Bennett talks about this. He said, what you often find in northern speech patterns is that they'll save the subject of the sentence until the very end of the sentence to give you a sense of suspense. Like, he's not had a bad life having one arm, our Albert. You know, you've got the he, but you don't know the subject. But he said the whole point is that it's done naturally, because there's a natural storytelling there. And in a way, it's better than received pronunciation, because received pronunciation is also grammatically correct. And actually, it's much more interesting when you, as he's not had a bad life having only one arm, our Albert. That it seems slightly awkward, but it's perfect, because it's you're not going to tell.
The reality is there. It sounds like something someone would say, which is possibly the hardest thing to do when you're writing.
And it's and certainly with gag lines. I mean, I spend hours writing, and there's a comic idea in this, whatever it is that you're writing. There's a comic idea, and you just have to get rid of everything that you don't need. And once you've got rid of it, you just know it's right. And Dodd said that every gag is like a clockwork mechanism, and if there's one cog wrong, the gag won't work. And of course, you can make your clock the way you want to make your clock. Ricky Gervais's speech patterns will not be the same as Woody Allen's, and will not be the same as Ken Dodd's. But they have. But as I say, with Jimmy Carr, he said it's a year's work. I mean, what is his show? What, 2 hours, whatever it is. But within the craft of that, it's a year. And he says he works on each gag, and he goes back to each gag and rephrases it and finds a different way of saying it. And when you watch him, it's absolutely perfect in its technicality. I
Yes.
mean, some people find it funny, some people don't. That doesn't really
Well,
matter.
yeah,
But
that's the
in the
subjective side. Yeah.
technicality, it's right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really
And so
interesting.
it's and so if you've got all this in your head as you're writing, and it isn't right on the paper, you've got an instinct. One of the problems is that I said to a friend of mine recently, I said, the only reason why anything I write is good is because I know it isn't good when I write it, and it needs to be rewritten. And the
Mm,
problems many writers have is that they don't know that it's not very good when they write it.
yeah, yeah.
And
Yes.
therefore they can't fix it. If you know it's not
Yeah.
very good when you write it, and you know it needs fixing, then
Mm,
that's a great skill to have that knowledge that it needs fixing. But I think
yeah.
I read stuff, and writers don't know that it needs fixing, and that's
Do you think that?
they
Do you
don't
think
they can't fix it.
there's a humility that's needed there? That's maybe I'm not always keen on just splitting things into north and south, but when you did Alan Bennett, and I was thinking about it, it got me thinking about Carolina Hearn and people like that, and how there's a real emotion there because and Victoria Wood, and there's a sadness and an emotion that because they're able to look at real life and transpose it onto the page and make it sad and make it funny. Is that informed sometimes by being from the north of England? There seems to be, I don't know,
I think there's a warmth there in the royal
mm,
family and Alan Bennett and Victoria Wood that you don't always get elsewhere. And I think
mm,
that all of them have an ear
yes,
for real life. I mean, it's interesting watching the Caroline Aherne documentary that was,
yeah, it was so
over
sad.
Christmas,
Yeah,
where she and Craig um, uh, they spent
Cash.
Craig Cash, yeah, sorry, they spent hours and hours watching the same documentary about the lady hairstylists, and
Yes.
they found the comedy in the ordinariness of it, and that's
Mm,
sort of what Alan Bennett does. And there was a documentary he did many years ago where he just stays at I think it's a hotel in Harrogate, and he stays there and he's eavesdropping all the conversations that are going on, which is what he has done all his life. And then look,
yeah.
I've got how many I've got these all over the house, right? They're everywhere, little post-it pads, and well, I've got you written down here, but I find words like custodian. I've written the word custodian here because I've thought of it. It's a better word than the one I had in the book, and then
Mm,
actually what I discovered was I'd already put it in the book. But anyway, that's another
right.
matter. But so everywhere, look, you just and I have these everywhere in the house. So every time
Yeah.
I think of something, it goes down because you forget it, frankly.
Yeah,
Um,
it's interesting you say that about like kind of having the ability or I guess it's like like I said before, maybe a bit of humility to kind of say this isn't perfect just because I did it. I can improve, I can edit. It needs this, and then we obviously talking about those other creators. When sometimes with creators such as those, if it was made from a different point of view about those people, it can sort of lean towards sneering at people who are maybe working class or from an area that people are not familiar with. So it's a kind of strange leap. I imagine a lot of, say, for example, Spitting Image would have been a lot of a real melting pot of people, but essentially from a because most politics happens in London. Was that interesting for you to kind of?
I mean, we did have Steve Coogan,
Mhm,
but pretty much before Steve came along, it was all public school boys.
mm,
And in terms of the writing team, the producer, director, not so much directors actually. No, the television directors came from a
mhm,
different background, but certainly the producers like John Lloyd, and they were fine with me, because I was doing Roy Hattersley and Alan Bennett, so I was able to bring an authentic sounding voice to those, and Chris could do the posher ones. I suppose that I've always been aware, and it's not so much a chip on the shoulder, but it's more to do with the fact that when I was at university, somebody genuinely said to me, "You shouldn't be here."
Mm.
No. I think he didn't mean it unpleasantly. He said, "But you've
No.
somehow slipped through," because my background is there on the internet. Very working class, one parent family. My mother came home and died. My father had schizophrenia. He was unemployed for years in the early 70s. We were sent off to grandma or auntie because there was no food in the house and all that sort of stuff. And I went to eventually live with my grandmother. Three of us shared an attic. So but education was my way out of that world.
Yes.
But I've always been aware that maybe I'm over aware of it. Of
I would say I totally identify with that, in the sense of sometimes I have an imagined thing to prove that maybe nobody else has had, but then there are moments when people make it explicitly clear that that you're not expected to do the things you're doing.
Well, here's a quick story. There was a very well-known writer called Howard Brenton. There was a professor of drama, and I think it was David Edgar, all gathered together. And they were talking about a play they had seen called Paul, which had been at the National. And I think they just made the assumption that I hadn't seen this play. And they talked about it, and they didn't say, "Oh, have you seen this play?" They just made the assumption that I hadn't seen it. It was about St. Paul. And they talked about it. And then once they'd sort of finished, I simply said, "I think there was a technical mistake, because no Jewish person in the 1st century AD would use the word Yahweh. So I think that was a technical mistake." And they looked at me as if to say, "How on earth do you know that?" Well, I went to a Jesuit school. And I studied scripture, and we studied a little bit of Hebrew, and I was aware that was a mistake in the text. That should not have been that word should not have been used, because it would never have been said. Because and I think I went on to say that the only person who ever said that word was the high priest once a year within the temple in Jerusalem. And they looked at me. It was a wonderful moment when
it was satisfying.
They just thought, right, okay, this guy isn't as thick as we thought it would. But here's the thing with David Edgar, who I liked. He's a great, good playwright. And he said to me one day, just before I was about to perform, he said, "Oh, I know you've been teaching at the university, Steve, but I always think of you as a northern comic." And it was that thing of just let's just keep you in your place.
And would that make it more satisfying then when you were able to sort of skewer the powerful with some of your
yes, a little bit. I mean, I absolutely. I mean, there's that. I was never as left wing as Roger Law but yeah, I mean, a dislike of authority, and I think that's also very northern. It's because there's trouble at mill. There's trouble at mill. A suspicion of anybody who's the sort of actually it was interesting, because you if they're high enough up, then there's a degree of respect. And Alan Bennett tells the story about his auntie, and when he was very young and he was 10 years old, and his auntie said, "Alan, do you see that gasworks over there? That's the biggest gasworks in Europe. And I know the manager." Now that would never be understood. That hierarchy would never be understood if in London they wouldn't get it. But I wouldn't know anybody quite as common as somebody who manages a gasworks. I know the Prime Minister.
That idea of I remember my grandma being she lived at the other end of a block of flats from her sister-in-law. and they were both in their 80s, and she was always really frustrated with my Auntie Annie because her son was a deputy head teacher, and she wouldn't stop going on about it. And and this would drive my grandma just, she just couldn't, she was almost so flustered she couldn't speak.
I had an auntie, the same Auntie Edie. She had two sons, and one was a fireman, one was a police officer. She just would never stop going on and on about it. Much to my own grandmother's embarrassment, because my father was a cleaner, and that's the only job he could get because of his mental illness. In those days, if you had if you'd been sectioned or whatever it was called then, it was very, very difficult to get a job in teaching, which is what he wanted to do, but he couldn't do it. And so he spent most of his life literally wiping up people's, but the tramps used to come into the church and do their business in the confessional.
Blimey.
And it was his job. The priest would go up to him and say, "Joe, can you clean out number 3?" And they'd use it as a toilet. And that was very interesting, because I never said this to Hugh Dennis, because Hugh Dennis was always going on about the fact that his father was a bishop.
Right.
You couldn't shut him up about it. And I sort of was tempted to say, well, my father also worked in a church, except he used to clean the shit of tramps off the,
Isn't it interesting? That seems to be a trait. And I'm not saying that Hugh Dennis is insufferable, but there's certainly people.
He's a nice guy.
Yeah, he seems like a very nice chap, and I don't know him. But I remember when I was at school that the son of the local, it was so difficult, and that often was the case. It's that even we're talking about working class background and things like that. There's still a sort of a status and status by proxy that people sometimes hold on to.
I didn't want to do it because I didn't do it because he's a nice guy. I wasn't trying to.
Yeah, he wasn't making points.
He wasn't making a point. It was just his father was a bishop and his father was in the House of Lords.
Yeah.
And if I had have told him that, I might have added. And who do you think Jesus would have been closest to? Who would you think Jesus would have gone to talk to? I think it would have been my father cleaning up the shit of tramps. Rather than a bishop.
I mean, that's and again, I guess it comes back to our things we hold on to that make us who we are, that give us that drive to sometimes prove people wrong, sometimes prove ourselves wrong, sometimes, like we say, prove. Maybe, like we said, with me, sometimes it has been a case of I need somebody there to tell me I can't do it, so that I do it.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I had somebody say you shouldn't be here, so I proved them wrong. But I think you can overdo it. Yeah, I think and I think it can be also destructive if you just go on. I knew somebody who drank himself to death, basically proving himself. He didn't pass his 11+, and that was always an issue with him. And he spent years of his life trying to prove to and he didn't get a great degree either. And then he started doing an MA, and he partly destroyed his life because he felt a failure. And I benefited from the 11+ system, and it was made for people such as myself. But in later life, I have understood that it defines somebody as a failure, and that is so wrong. And I said I've seen it destroy somebody's life. So I was on the lucky side of the on the 11+ side of things. I got into serious trouble actually at university because and I'm seeing him next week, one of my former students, and I was teaching a film course, screenwriting course, and I basically said, look, what's the purpose of stories? What's the purpose of telling each of the stories? It's to understand others and to understand ourselves. It's a mixture of the two. And And actually, films can give you an understanding of yourself. In you're affected by certain films, and it can give you an understanding, and blah blah blah. So many people talk about The Shawshank Redemption, which I think is a great film, but I don't connect to it because I've never felt trapped. People who are trapped in marriages or in jobs, they really connect with Shawshank because it's about a prison and they feel trapped. And I've never really felt like that, but I understand why they are. And anyway, this lad called Jamie, and who happened to have two mothers, his biological mother and her partner. And he spent all his life going on as a kid, going on to No Clause 28 and gay right. He's not gay, but he went on all these things. And then he said to me, he said, "Do you know, I watched Fight Club and it really had a big impact on me." I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Because I realized that's what I had missed, because I wanted to be a lad as well, and I never had my opportunity to be a lad. I loved going on the demonstrations and so on." But so I said, "Well, write about that. Write about how you connected to this film and how you understood yourself better because of watching this film." So he wrote this essay. I thought it was brilliant. And because it was, I said, it's what stories do. It helps you understand yourself. And you've told me that. The outside examiner came and said, "How has this got a first?" Because there are no footnotes and there's not even a bibliography at the end. And I said, "Well, that's not the point."
Yeah.
The point is, for him to explore himself and through the film.
Yeah.
But it needs a bibliography and it needs a reading, and I didn't care about any of those things. And it slightly went to a sort of arbitration. And I told the students that I'd given it a very good mark, and my overseer basically said, "That saved you, Steve, because if we mark him down, he can sue." Because you've given him an 80, and the examiner wanted to give him a third. He wanted to give him 48 or something. And so I got into trouble for that, because it's one of the reasons I never said in academia, because you have to play it by their rules. I was a maverick. The students liked me, and the staff liked me because I was a maverick, and the students who were maverick tended to gravitate, towards me. And I used to invite them round to my home. I taught it for several years, and I invited, on a Sunday night, I used to invite the students round to watch a film. And one of the films was a film called Harold and Maude.
Oh, yes.
And which is one of my favorite films. And there were students who just did not get that film. It's about an 80-year-old woman having an affair with an 18-year-old boy who wants to commit suicide. And you never see them consummate their relationship. No. And the point is that she knows she's going to die, and she wants to stop him wanting to commit suicide. Therefore, she encourages him to think about living and not dying. It's
very sweet, isn't it?
It's a sort of black comedy about death and life. And so many of my students just went, "We're not sure about this, Steve."
Yeah.
But I always knew that the ones who loved it, I'd keep in contact with.
Yeah, there's a sweet spot of time around them with certain movies, whether it was like Five Easy Pieces or films like that were around that time that we've never really got back to. They really do stand on their own as unique and creative.
Yeah, and Five Easy Pieces I used to teach because it sort of defies everything about screenwriting that you're taught. The protagonist must have a dilemma, and the protagonist must go to a low point, and the protagonist must overcome his demons, and at the end of the film triumph, and all the rest of it. And over the course of the action, the challenges must get bigger and bigger and bigger. And if I remember correctly, right at the end of the movie, Jack Nicholson simply runs away and he climbs through a window and goes. If that was presented to a film somebody who it was interesting. I forgotten his name now. What's his name? He was a theatre writer. It'll come to me later, but I went to a couple of conferences and he was there, and he used to say, "Have you been McKeed?" Meaning, had you gone on the Robert McKee course? And basically what he said was, all writers should read Robert McKee, but no producer should ever be allowed to read Robert McKee, because as soon as they read Robert McKee or the modern equivalent, that they think they know it all. And that's the thing. And actually, you maybe one of the reasons we don't get 5 easy pieces now, or the Harold and Maude, is that you would get people saying, no, that's bad screenwriting. You can't write a hero like that. It's an anti-hero. Well, yes, I know, but he's got to have and
he just leaves.
He just leaves. He just climbs the window and leaves.
Yeah. Even more startling than The Graduate, really, isn't it? At least in The Graduate, you got some music and
the time limit on The Graduate, and they get married and they still, and that ends. See, I talk about dialogue. No dialogue. They just sit there on that bus and look at each other, and that's all you need. It's they could have, but it's just brilliant. And again, you might get somebody saying, "Oh, we need a scene here. We need them to talk," and no, you don't need all that. No, there is it may come back, but I think Robert McKee. I've done the Robert McKee course a couple of times, and I've done others, and it's all very, very helpful. But I think they're not rules; it's guidances. There's a guide here. And it's I used to forget about rules. It's useful to know certain things, technical things, but actually just write your story. Forget about. Somebody said to me, they said, "Do you use software to write?" I said, "Why would I use software?" "Oh, well, it will help you with your writing." I said, maybe it would. It wouldn't. I spoke to a copywriter recently, and she said she uses it because it takes the text and makes it simpler. I don't think I could do it. And I also, they said, what do you write? And I said, well, I use a pencil. They said, you use a pencil? He laughed at me. And I said, yeah, but a pencil is great, because at primary school we used a pencil. And the great thing about a pencil, particularly, that I always buy these, which is a 3B pencil, they're very soft, which means that you can write incredibly quickly, which means you can write at the speed that your brain thinks.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the key.
And you're not worrying about spell checks. You're not worrying about, have you spelt that word? And also, when I was writing Swidges, Granny and William, I never used to write Granny and William. It's a G or a W. And you put all that in later. You don't need so many writers, they're typing every single word out, and then they have to have in that format and all that.
I'm glad you've said that, because it intimidated me. After I left university and went into teaching, I didn't really do any screenwriting for about maybe 15 plus years. And
actually, just tell your story, and if the stakes aren't big enough, then fix the stakes later on. And I've just written a screenplay, and so this is, if you like, an exclusive, but I've written some ghost stories, and I wanted some of them to be in a different format. So I've written an M.R. James style ghost story, and I've written I've written one as emails, very modern sort of feel, and then I had an idea for a ghost story, and the idea was very visual, so I decided to write it as a screenplay. I don't think it's ever going to be produced, and it's not been written to be produced. It's been written to be in a collection, because lots of young people now quite like reading screenplays in the way that that wouldn't have happened 40 years ago. People buy screenplays to read. And I just decided to tell it because in my head, the story was all images. And I just, to be honest, I didn't want to write a very long story where I'd have to describe every single image in fancy language. And the great thing about a screenplay is it's incredibly economical. The only thing I have done is I am using Courier Point 12 because that is, the Hollywood. The reason why the Hollywood uses Courier as a type font or typeface is that that's what the early scripts were written on.
Yes.
And if it's that size and if it's laid out on a paper in that particular way, they sort of know that on average, each page is a minute. And that's why that font continues to be used. And also, bizarrely, it was never copyrighted or trademarked, whatever it is. With certain fonts, you have to pay for them if you use them. But the courier company typewriter, they never copyrighted the type font, so it's free, so anybody can use it. But it's a horrible font to look at. Much better. I use Calibri, like lots of other people, but it's a horrible font to read. But it's still done in Courier because Hollywood recognize it, and they can work out, as I say, how many minutes. If you've got a 120-page script, that's a 2-hour movie.
That's interesting, because when I look at you, I dug out my copy of I, Margaret, and in there you've got the memos, and the memos are hilarious, and it reminds me of in sort of silent films or films where there's maybe like a newspaper thing pops up, or a shopping list, or something that appears, like you say, maybe tells the story in a different way, an email. I know the time waster letters, because
I in preparation for the ghost stories, I read about 200 ghost stories. So over the past 3 years, so I read about 100, 100 Victorian ghost stories, and since then I've read about 100. So you get us. But actually, the Victorians actually were more interesting because they did tell stories in diary form.
It feels a bit transgressive reading somebody else's letter as well, doesn't it?
It does, absolutely. But also the idea I had for one story was just right. It was two female friends talking to each other, and it just seemed better to do that with emails.
Yes.
And I've got another one I haven't finished it yet. I haven't even started it yet, and I want to write that as a diary. And I say the collection has got M.R. James in it and a tribute to Victorian, but I wanted something ultra modern, and that's, in terms of format, that's why I've written as a screenplay, in a screenplay format, and it's very visual. I've sent it out to people in the industry, but it's not written to be. Primarily to be wonderful if somebody did, but
Film Freeway is fantastic for that, because there's just things on there that you can, like, I sent off to a festival in Greece, and it was accepted as as one of the ones for it didn't win, but it was read, and it was I got my dream after watching Woody Allen films and Kevin Spacey. I got the little palm leaves. I can put official selection on it, so I'm happy. I can retire happy. So it was fascinating.
I've always said I'd never write one because I just know too many people who wrote screenplays, and they're trying to get, like, novels. People write novels, and it's a real, because a screenplay is going to cost you $6 million to make, and that's one of the problems with it. But at least with the novel, you can now just put it on Amazon if you want to.
That's true. That's true.
But no, I mean, it was here's as well the way life works. So I won't mention the publisher, but we sent the ghost stories to one particular publisher, and we got to know within a couple of days, because my Instagram numbers weren't big enough. My social media wasn't big enough, wasn't impressive enough. They didn't read them.
This is why we end up with 70,000 David Walliams books.
Yes, it's.
No, I'm not being obtuse, but
it cuts everybody else out, and if your criteria is celebrity, then it's it. So yes. This particular publisher, who specializes in horror, said actually also, we prefer horror to ghost stories, and they are different. So they said, could you write a horror novel? And I thought, well, no. I mean, what am I going to do? Write a horror novel next Tuesday afternoon? I've got a spare afternoon. I'll write a horror novel.
This is what I've
I
done.
said no, and then, but then the brain's funny. So the next morning, I woke up with a horror image in my head, and then I thought about it and talked to some friends of mine, and and I find, I don't know about you, but I find talking about the story can reveal to yourself as you talk what it is that the story is about. So you talk to people many writers are very confidential. They don't, oh, if someone's going to steal my idea, I'm not going to talk about it. But I know people in the industry, so I chatted to a friend of mine who works on Fright Fest, the big horror thing.
It's fantastic.
And we chatted, and he was great, and he said, write what you're frightened of. You personally write what you're frightened of. And then that night I had a dream, which is the most horrific dream. It really frightened me. So I put that in the story.
Exactly.
I wasn't comfortable writing horror because it's not something that I've ever done before. But actually, I sort of realised that the Ghost collection needed a proper horror. I know. So maybe I should send it to you because you're.
Oh, I'd love to read it. I would absolutely. Honestly, the last. I worked backwards because at university, when I was studying film, I didn't touch horror, didn't go near it. And the moment I left, I started working backwards, and I worked from sort of around Nosferatu up to. I'm up to around the 2010s now, with a few modern ones in between. But.
Yeah, well, both Nosferatus, because I remember watching what 1920 something, and that shadow is brilliant. And I've got it here. I've got it. I don't know if you've read this book. It's which I mentioned earlier. So these are all some of the ghost stories I'm reading at the moment. And Stephen King's book. Dan's Macabre on horror is absolutely brilliant.
I haven't read that. I've read his. I think it's called On Writing.
On Writing, that's brilliant. Yeah. But this is specifically mainly movies, but he does talk about and he talks about the psychology of the horror writer, because he's often asked, why are you so weird? Basically, why do you write weird stuff? And do you think
where does this come from?
And is there something wrong with the people who watch weird stuff and horror? And he talks about that, and he's brilliant at analyzing other people's work as well as his own. He's able to put his eye on his own work. So that's and I learned a lot reading that book. But as I said, my friend basically said, write what you're frightened of. And the other thing that I did a course, Society of Authors course during COVID, and the one thing I learned from that course, went on for a couple of hours, but the one thing I took away from that course, they said, when you write something, give the writing a backstory, give a personal reason why you are writing this. And I thought that's really interesting. And so when I did this destination time travel, I talked about being a kid and the little porch in the house being a TARDIS and going on to the outside world, and all the journalists picked up on that. That was the one thing that they all put in their their story. Anyway, with horror, maybe I do have a horror thing, because when I was 8 years old, we lived in Seaforth Road in Leeds, and it was a terraced house, and down there was a cellar, two cellars, and there was a wall between the two cellars, and I think there was a little area where you probably used to keep the coal. When I was 8, I used to go down into the cellar, and I used to go into the area where the coal had been kept, and there was absolutely no light whatsoever. It was pure darkness. And I used to stand there and challenge myself with fear. And it would get so much that I genuinely thought something was coming out the blackness. And then I'd shake, and then I'd run upset. And a friend of mine said, you did that? You really did that? I said, absolutely. I used to do that. And so if the horror stories or if the ghost stories are ever told, that's going to be my backstory to why they were told.
Yeah, that's something that, again, it's put a picture in my mind straight away. Beside that, there is often some very serious, almost kitchen sink type, right? Whether it's Christine or It or something like that. That maybe certainly I wouldn't, because I shy away from, and certainly as I've got older and I get a little bit more emotional, I shy away from things that are going to make me sad. However, when you read the things, whether it is like It, for example, there's some abuse in there, and there's some really sad
Well,
and dark things. So
it's a sad and dark world, and
yeah,
he I can't remember the name of the writer he quotes, but the one of the horror writers is a friend of his. A journalist says to him one day, "So really, all you want to do is shock people, isn't it?" He said,
Hmm.
"Yeah, because people need to be shocked. Because
Ah,
look at the world that we're living in. We need
yeah.
to shock ourselves more often." And he didn't take the word shock as a bad thing, just to
No,
shock
no.
people. He said,
Well, I
"Yeah,
guess it ties in. I read somewhere, and correct me if you're wrong, that you when you were talking about playing Margaret Thatcher and that role, and we talk about the grandmother character in the Swidges as well. You talked about your grandmother having conviction, and often when people have conviction, it's not about trying to shock, but it's about getting their point across very clearly. My grandma was exactly the same. Um, uh, you know, it's that kind of that's the realness of it, isn't it? The conviction, because you care and you're putting your point across in that
the
way.
realness."
It
Yes,
makes it real.
I think that I think the difference, I suppose, with Mrs. Thatcher was well, my grandmother was a loving, tough love Northern
Mm.
grandmother, and there was kindness there as well, and thoughtfulness, which I
Yes.
don't think is quite there in Mrs. Thatcher, in the
No.
same way. But indomitable. I mean, that's the thing. That's the word I would use, indomitable, because
Yeah.
the,
But
the
you have to
men,
have a hook,
every
don't
all
you?
the,
I imagine you have to have a hook, whether it's one little trait that you can kind of
yeah,
like a
and
seed, I
funny. I mean,
imagine, is it?
I tell you what happened. I was preparing the book and thinking about it, and I spoke to my old English teacher, and I said, "Do you remember my grandmother?" He said, "Oh God, Mrs. Oddie." I said, "Do you remember her name?" He said, "Oh yeah, we'll never forget. We were terrified of her, Steve. All the teachers were terrified of her."
Yeah.
And I thought, well, to me, she was my savior. She was my protector. I couldn't understand why they'd be frightened of her. And she's a little old lady. She wasn't a very big lady.
Yes.
She said, "Oh, we were terrified of her." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, she was 70. She'd lived through 2 world wars, and she was a tough lady."
Yeah, not
And
afraid of
I said,
anything.
"Well, how frightened of her were you?" He said, "Put it like this: it was at bowel movement level."
I
Which,
love it.
and then in when he told me that, he said we were terrified at parent teachers evening when she came,
Yeah,
and she
I've
she
been
was
there.
probably more, and that's in the book.
Mm,
There's a whole chapter. It's quite a funny chapter when she confronts the. You could just about do without it in story terms, in terms of its narrative. But
mm,
I wrote it to be. It does make a point about the nature of swidgers. It's quite because a good thing happens
yeah,
in it. But it's primarily there because the teachers were terrified of her, and I just love the idea of a 12-year-old having a granny that
yes,
goes to parent teachers and turning the tables on the teachers.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so that's why.
I think there's quite a lot of people who would definitely think that needs to be in the story, um, because certainly for me, it reminds me of the story of my grandma going in and giving a punch to. Speaking as somebody who's been in education most of my life, in one way or another. I'm not condoning this, but
No, no, no.
I think there was a back in the day when people were hit with sticks and things. She'd go in and clobbered the teacher. And she was
Quite
again
right.
5 foot tall, 5 foot tall, in and out of hospital most of her life. Kind of helped out by Bernardo's, but yeah, they would have probably been hiding from her as well when. So I for me personally, that speaks to me. and it gives me a real understanding of character that you can't do without.
Well, here's the thing about the book. The book hasn't been successful. I mean, that for all sorts of reasons. That it's a small publisher, and and I've learned if you don't get into Waterson's, it's almost impossible. So there's part 2, and hopefully part 3 at some stage. But it's a real difficult, it's a really difficult sell. And I'm just hopeful eventually that the teachers say to me, look, this is a good book, Steve.
Yes.
And I know exactly the kids that will get it. Now, it's not at the same numbers as Harry Potter, and that's a different audience. But teachers have said to me, there are children out there that will absolutely. I know kids that have read it 2 or 3 times.
Yes.
And
I can totally imagine that. And sometimes I would find when I was reading to the children that the quality of text was often determined by the time you had to think about it. So when I was leading English for a while in a school, I really broke it down and was like, let's find some books that you really are excited to read. Let's not just go Harry Potter, David Williams, whatever's on W.H. Smith's. And actually find some books that you're excited to read and ring fence time to read to children. And I feel like the most important, about 20 odd years of working in education, I think the time when I got through to children the most was actually going, making time to read and reading with them. And we've cried together, whether it was Michael Rosen's Sad Book, whether it was, there's one called The Runaways we read, or whether it's, there's a great one that came out, Polly Ho Yen, that was kind of paralleled COVID, but it was just these big, almost Night of the Triffid kind of things that came up. And all these were just, we laughed, we cried, we shared, we taught, we discussed. And none of those books were, and I'm not disparaging any massive authors, but for me, I would not have had that if I hadn't had the time or took the time to read them myself. And that sometimes just doesn't happen.
Well, yes, it's. I mean, the feedback I've had is that the books are good, the story's good, it's funny.
Yeah.
Granny's funny. But here's again, we're going back to how we talked earlier. Is it because it's set in the north, or in the sense that Granny is such a northern character? I think partly it is because there are people who've read the book that didn't find Granny funny, and didn't find what she said funny, didn't understand her at all. And I just, I had also equally, I had neighbours from Wales who said, we've been reading your book, and she said, I've laughed 6 times, which is highly unusual when you're reading a book. She said, it's your Granny character is so funny. But there are, and I wonder whether or not it was oddly enough published by an Edinburgh Scottish publisher that's very removed from the way London publishers think. And I can't remember his name, but there was a northern writer, very successful northern writer, and basically said, look, let's be honest, the publishing industry is controlled by 200 mainly white, mainly public school educated, mainly women, and they all know the same. Well, I put it like this: they've read every story in the world, but they've never lived one.
Right.
And they know their stuff, and they publish stuff that's very, very successful, but it's not that diverse in terms of color, in terms of ethnic background, in terms of where's the working class girl from Scunthorpe who's now in charge of a department at Bloomsbury? Maybe they exist, but they all.
Well, that kind of is echoed by people I speak to in film who maybe are trying to get funding from, say, the BFI or someone like that, and the way they see it as an independent filmmaker, that that there's a lot of people with incredible talent, incredible skill that have just not been able to, just don't. It's not poverty porn, or it's not a sort of what's the word, period piece. Can we squeeze that into your story? And I think it ties in with what you were saying before, about horror. Like, I've done some ghost stories. Can we get some blood and guts in it? Or
it's frustrating. I mean, luckily I've got a publisher, and so on. But I came across a complete brick wall with anybody I sent it to in London. And maybe maybe it just wasn't good enough or whatever, but it's got published. But it's a problem.
Worth asking the question, isn't it?
It's worth asking the question because I'm a great fan of diversity. It's absolutely right that every voice, every type of story should be heard. And yet, when you see pictures of the literary editors and the people who work in publishing, they all seem to look as if they'd gone to Durham University and done, creative writing courses, and you get so many, in your submission, which creative writing course did you do and at which university? Well, where's the person who said, who needs I don't care what color they are or what sex they are, whatever sexuality they are, but where's the person from Scunthorpe?
Yes.
Or Grimsby or Hull or Bolton?
The life experience experience.
Has a story to tell.
It's very funny. I was interviewing somebody the other day for my actual real job, and he was talking about how he takes on people for his it's an education. It's like pupil referral unit for children who are struggling in mainstream. And he was talking to me about how they interview for people to join the team. And what he mentioned, which blew me away, was that he could ask about, what lessons, a lesson that you teach and all the mechanics of it, and, show me a good lesson and a lesson observation and which degree did you get and all this kind of thing. But he asks them cultural questions, like, we work over 2 sites. Often people become a little bit tribal when we don't see each other very often. How would you deal with that? And like kind of seeing like, and if the answer is I haven't got a clue because I've never been in any of these, then maybe you're not the right cultural fit. And I Googled cultural fit questions, and it blew my mind because I was like, I've been asking all the wrong questions for years.
Well, and they talk a different language, to me. I've spoken to literary agents, and it's almost a different way of thinking, and they talk about branding, and I'm sure that they're right in terms of how they make money, so that they are right. But it is a frustration that there is and this writer, I've forgotten his name now, I wish I could remember his name. The assumption is boys don't read. Boys don't read books. So don't, and you've got that problem as soon as you write a book with a boy in it. Boys don't read. And actually somebody did read my book and said, did you know you've made William non-gender? I said, no. He said, no, you've not made him a boy or a girl. And that's good because a boy and a girl could connect with the character. But here's the thing about the way television has changed, particularly ITV, and to some degree BBC. But in the old days, ITV used to have Yorkshire television, it used to have Granada, it used to have Tyne Tees, it used to, and it used to have, each area used to have its own head of department in terms of comedy. I don't think Tyne Tees had, but certainly Yorkshire television had comedy, Granada had comedy,
Central, I think, as well.
And they knew the local writers, and they knew that the local people. And I knew them. There was a guy called, I think it was Johnny Hammond at Granada, and LWT had, and I think sometimes when I see I went to a conference run by the Royal Television Society, and people were talking about sitcom, and I said, they said, oh, we've got all this, diversity. I said, okay, where is the working class sitcom at 6:30 on a Saturday night that used to dominate in the 1970s, that was written by somebody in Granada or Yorkshire Television, that local head of department had found, and then was persuaded that the network would take it, or whatever it was. Where's the equivalent of, the On the Bosses? Now, I'm not saying we should bring On the Bosses back, but I said, where is the equivalent of the sitcom where a working class family can sit round the table at that time of evening on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, whatever, and see themselves and see
is that why it doesn't feel very authentic sometimes when we watch, say, a drama? There was one, and I'll be honest, I don't watch a lot of television. I'll watch movies and I watch things on YouTube and things like that. But one of the things it came up the other day, it was something to do with a flood, and it was set in Yorkshire, and every character was putting on a terrible, awful Yorkshire accent, and it took me right out of it, and I was like, this is so it just didn't feel authentic.
Don't get it. You quite rightly, there's a discussion about disabled actors and black actors and Asian actors. No one's going to do blackface anymore, and yet there's the equivalent with Yorkshire face, where they get somebody from the south putting on I years ago I auditioned for a BBC producer who didn't know that there was a difference between a Lancashire accent and a Yorkshire accent. He said, I just thought it was North. I discovered this. Isn't it interesting? They're different. And I thought, of course, that's the different thing about my accent. If I, for character worker, because I've auditioned quite a few times for Coronation Street, and they like me, and we can see, what sort of character you could play, Steve, but it's not been written yet, so we'll have to wait. But I suspect that my accent doesn't exist anymore, in the sense that my accent comes from the 70s. And all accents move on. So Cilla Black, Kate Robbins pointed this out to me. She said, nobody talks like Cilla Black in Liverpool anymore.
Yeah.
But my auntie still talks like Cilla Black, because that's how people used to talk in the 50s and 60s. So Cilla Black's Liverpool accent was authentic, but not authentic to the time that she was in. It was authentic to the time she came from, because then she moved to London and she never really went back to Liverpool, and therefore she had a different sound. And I'm, if guilty is the right word, I'm guilty of that too. So my accent, my northern accent, comes from the 70s, but it's not remotely like my family now, that are still up there. I went to see them last week, and they talk in a completely different way. So
there's definitely a melding of
it's a shame, really, because I watch Coronation Street, and I think it's the regional identity isn't quite there anymore, because they used to employ people from the working men's clubs, people that they could act, and Lynn Perry and people like that.
There's no Percy Sugdens.
The Percy Sugdens as well, because he came from Variety days, there's not quite the equivalent of the Percy Sugdens. It's a different show, and it's great and all the rest of it, but it's not quite as it used to be, when they were able to draw on all that.
I find it fascinating, and I guess in a way I can kind of tie a lot of things in, we've talked a lot about regional identity and also like personal identity throughout the characters and the stories and the books, but also your acting. So when you're doing the voices, and I was very conscious when I was interviewing you, I was like, I don't want to be, I imagine it sometimes must feel like you're being, someone is thinking about you as a human jukebox. So I didn't want to do that.
I do remember saying to a friend of mine years ago when I was at university, I said, I'm not a jukebox. I'm happy to, I'm happy. I don't actually do that many voices anymore professionally. I'll tell you one quick story about doing David Attenborough, which is the whole Northern identity thing. When sometimes you're talking with people who are frankly posher than you are and all the rest of it, you tend to correct, or some people, you sometimes get on the phone and slightly correct your way of speaking.
You're Alison PK, but yeah.
So I had this line, and I delivered the line. Everybody burst out laughing when I delivered it, and I said, "What's wrong?" They said, "You don't realise what you've said, have you?" I said, "No." And they played it back to me, and oh god! So I was doing Attenborough, doing David Attenborough, and I said, "And now, if we take this stone and lift this stone up, we can see an entire colony of ants, and these ants."
You've been correcting yourself for so long.
I've been correcting my auntie, not my aunt, the auntie.
Yeah, so, anti-violence,
Auntie, so
yeah. My question wasn't. I was certainly not going to go down the list, but I was thinking, does it? If some you must have more warmth towards than others. So, like, I went down your list, and I was thinking, like, oh, to be able to do, and this is going to sound a bit silly because it's quite a disparate group, but you know that because you did them. But Kenneth Williams and Ringo Starr, Felicity Kendall, Les Dawson, people like this who people have warmth towards. Do you approach that differently than, say, doing Gorbachev or Enoch Powell or Saddam Hussein?
Well, I've never done Felicity Kendall. I tell you, I did do Penelope Keith.
Penelope Keith, maybe I've written that down, just thinking about the one that I had a crush on.
So Penelope Keith, I can't remember. I don't know that there's a connecting thing. Yes, indeed. I haven't done it for ages, but yes, indeed. Oh, Barbara. And so that's sort of very sort of factual. I think again, she's an indomitable character, and I think that is the key phrase. The politics.
To have
that power. So I'd rather do Penelope Keith than Felicity Kendall. With the warmth side, I think probably my favorite is Beryl Reid, because I just think there is and it was a challenge. A friend of mine, producer, said to me, "I challenge you to do Beryl Reid. You could do it. Nobody's done it. No one's ever done it. You have a go." And with Beryl Reid, it's such a warm voice and really engaging, and it's rather lovely. And I'll quickly tell you my anecdote about Beryl Reid, which I had dinner with this friend of mine who now lives in America, and he was on an episode of Doctor Who. He was in Doctor Who with Beryl Reid, and in those days they used to do read-throughs, and it was where she was playing Captain Briggs, I think, which is named after Nicholas Briggs, who does the Dalek voices, who runs a company now called Big Finish. Anyway, so she was playing this character, and she knew nothing about anything to do with sci-fi. It was complete mystery to her. And about 1985, and anyway, she had the script, and she was at the reading, probably in North Acton. She said, "And now I want you to send the ship into warp drive." And then she stopped and looked around and said, "Warp drive? Is that like Acacia Avenue?"
Oh, that's amazing.
That's my Doctor Who anecdote.
That's so good.
I was a cyber woman in a Doctor Who sketch with Lenny Henry show. And I occasionally at Comic-Con get people who come up with a picture, because it was a piss take of Thatcher. So with the
big metal hair,
it was a cyber woman or a cyber man with a big hair, and it was clearly meant to be Thatcher. And they mess around with the voice and stuff. But occasionally I get people at stage doors and so on, which with a picture of that. So I'm certain that's as near as I've ever got to the Doctor Who.
So in terms of like the people that you've done so many of them. If that's such a great way of putting it, people you've done. But I'm very well spoken. I am. But people who maybe were skewered by the writers in such a way that time has proven it to be, that you felt a little bit like, oh, that's a nice person who maybe it was like, say, for instance, I always think about Graham Taylor. Like, he's obviously a lovely man who's just, relentlessly, mainly the newspapers, to be honest, who were meanest to him. But is there things like that?
Well, what happened was with Alan Bennett, I went up to John Lloyd and I said, John, I don't think anybody's ever done Alan Bennett before, and I've developed a little voice because he's from Leeds, and that top lip is rather tight, and he never shows his teeth, and all the rest of it. And he said, Steve, it's a great voice, but I don't want to do Alan Bennett because I like him and I admire him. So anyway, I tried again. I said, well, I'm sure we could do some. And then I think it was Kate Robbins said, well, I could do Thora Hird. And, she did a good Thora Hird. And I think somehow John was persuaded to allow me to make the puppet of Alan Bennett. And they didn't. But once they had him with Thora Hird, our director, John Henderson, said, those sketches are absolutely crucial to the way the show works, because you have this really hard hitting satire, and then you cut to Alan and Thora living together and making little funny comments about what they're watching, a little bit like Gogglebox thing that there is. And it's ahead of its time in that. He said it levens the hard hitting politics. It just for 20-30 seconds of niceness, it just changes the direction. And he said, we now think of them as punctuation that
makes perfect sense as well, because in terms of some those characters, certainly to me anyway, or people of my age, maybe 40s and above, those are timeless people. Whereas, like, if there's something we need to say about David Steele, that age is a little bit more people are just going to be like,
It's also, I also realized something about Coronation Street when I was working with Kate, and there was a character years ago on Coronation Street. I think he was called Chalky. He was a bin man, and he never worked. The character never worked. And the writer put out a tweet recently and said, we had this great character called Chalky. He's a very tall man with bald head and thing. And he never quite worked. We never really worked out why. And I think I worked it out for him, because the real strength of Coronation Street is a double act. Every character has to find the double, and they never found a double. They never found the straight man comedy woman.
The humor is there, isn't it? In Jack and Vera.
When you watch Coronation, and of course Les Dennis and his partner in the 80s,
was it Roy Barraclough that did it with?
Justin G.
Oh, Justin G.
Doing Mavis and Rita. And that Mavis and Rita routine that was like a comedy routine. Likewise, previous generation, Minnie Caldwell and Ina Sharples, and then you had Stan and Hilda. So those actors really worked well with each other for the comedy, and I don't quite see that on Coronation Street in the same way that I used to. So anyway, if you go on Coronation Street, not only do you have to have a character that works, you've then got to find your partner. The writers have got to find the character, and Percy Sugden and Phyllis.
Phyllis, yeah.
So
that was the first impression. Probably one of the first impressions I tried to do was Phyllis. Simon. Yeah, like Percy, like that.
He was
as a 7-year-old boy.
Well, John Thompson was working on the show at the time. He was on Coronation Street. He used to come back. He used to do Coronation Street and Spitting Image, and he used to come back and he used to have because Percy, Waddington, was he called Warrington? I forget he had, I think, yeah. He had he had the scripts in the hat. So he used to go in and then he used to be a cutaway of him taking the hat off, and he used to hold the hat, and because he couldn't remember the line, so all all the scripts was always in the hat. But they had older people in those days as well.
Yeah,
Anyway,
it's probably not sexy enough now, is it?
it's
It's
probably
really,
not sexy enough, but they were funny, you know.
yeah.
They were funny.
My mum said once Kevin had an affair, she stopped watching. which I think is the perfect encapsulation of modern soap operas.
Well, actually, Sally and Kevin each having an affair.
Well, this is it. She was just like, no, sorry, they wouldn't do that. You know, these normal people, they don't have time to have affairs.
They don't have time to. You know, he's under the car all the time. You know, no, I'm not attacking Coronation Street, and I'd love to be on it one day.
No. But, yeah, sure. I get what you're saying, though. It's just a different kind of approach.
Yeah, I got close, you know, and maybe sometimes I've just a completely different track because you know, talk about everything. I've just been reading the 999-page autobiography of Barbara Streisand, and you know, Barbara, I'm a big fan, always have been. And she basically says, you know, in life there's certain things you can't have. You want them, and people say, "You're Barbara Streisand. You can have everything." No, they can't. There's certain things you can't have. And I suspect for me, it's going to be Coronation Street. Is the one thing I would have loved to have been involved in, but you know, so
I mean, as long as there is a Norris, there is hope. I think that's
well, they need a Norris, you know. I think that's what it is. But you know, and they know me there, and I've been up a few times, and I always get a little when I sort of write to them, and they always write back to me and say, oh, you know, we're waiting, Steve. You know, just you know, we'll
it's such a cultural touchstone of the North as well, isn't it? Like I'm from Stockport originally, and our only school trip that we ever went on was to Granada Studios. So I must have been on the thing on the street 4, 5, 6 times as a kid. And then you go around and it show you other things, you know, like This Morning or whatever. And one of the things that always made me laugh was one of the exhibits that they had at the Granada Studios was the internet. And it was a big, massive tracker ball for you to move around this thing and the screen. And it said, one day, you won't even have to go to school. You know, you'll just log on and your teacher will be there. And I was thinking, this is like, you know, in the 80s. And I was thinking, well, I hope you hurry up with this. And sadly, it was a few years after that
there was a writer. Well, I was at university with him, a very bright guy. And his father used to run a theatre company, Theatr Clwyd, up in Mold. And Coronation Street in those days used to be on only twice a week, and he knew all about Shakespeare because he'd read all of Shakespeare. He was only about 18, but his whole background was theatre. And I mentioned Coronation Street one day. He said, "I've never watched it. I never watched it," and it was that complete dismissive-ness of it.
Yeah.
And
like it's a badge of honor to not do something.
I never watched. and I was trying to say to him, this is incredibly fine writing. It's a play. It's a half-hour play twice a week, and some of those scenes, the comedy, the seriousness of it, when you look at them now, it's really incredibly well. And Jack Rosenthal wrote it, and so on. He just didn't get it, and well, he didn't get it because he didn't watch it, and that very patronizing at it. I slightly fell out with him, oddly enough, over it because I was in awe of him because he'd seen so many plays because his father ran a theatre company. But at the same time, I thought, well, you're cutting yourself off for arguably what is the best drama every Monday and Wednesday. That deserves much bigger credit than it gets because the writing was. My auntie used to. It was the one thing that that we had to watch, and we all watched it. You know, when it was funny, and
that humor very similar to you'd see. You know, we talked earlier on about Carolina Hearn, and you know it's the royal family. It is a direct descendant of that style of
Well, here's the thing about the
writing.
royal family, and so I was aware of the royal family, but I'd not seen it. And then my family always used to come and stay with me at Christmas, and they said, "Oh, by the way, Steve, we'll watch all the films, because you've got loads of DVDs. We want to watch the royal family." I said, "Absolutely, watch it." And that we put it on, and it was one of the Christmas episodes. I think it's the one where Liz Smith talks about the Body Shop shampoo that she's got being given, and it hasn't been tested on dogs. You never know, do you? You don't. What do you? And anyway, you're laughing.
Wafer thin ham. Wafer thin ham. Yeah.
Where's the thin ham? And so anyway, it was on. I think it was its second or third season, whatever. And sadly I'd never seen it. And the family stopped watching the television, and they just all watched me watching the television. I never laughed so much because I said, "This is absolutely brilliant."
Oh, it's so powerful in so many. It's so powerful. Like there's the Christmas episode with when she's giving birth and they're in the bathroom. I can't. I'm in just in floods and Nana passing away. Every little thing, and maybe it really does hit home.
Well, it's so funny, isn't it? When what were her last words? Trevor McDonald. It was just,
yes.
And so many people won't get why that's funny.
No,
it's
just
they're the same people who don't get Granny in my book.
Yes, maybe we don't want those people.
Maybe we don't want those. Wait. When the vegetarians, and what does she say to the vegetarians?
You can eat.
Oh, what a shame for you.
Yeah, it's funny. The little things like that, they give you such a massive backstory. Because I would say my upbringing is I am Anthony. Like if you would say, I am Anthony from the Royals. But Dave, when they ask him what he's had for his tea, and he just goes Dairy Leon toast, and that for me tells you everything you need to know about Denise as domestic goddess.
Well, here's the other thing. A friend of mine who's from the sort of south, I was telling him the story of the family, watching me watching, and he was slightly patronizing. He said, "Yes, but do they get it? Do they get it?"
Oh, yeah.
I said, "Of course they get it." And and I remember watching, and there was a later episode, I think, because the baby Michael being born by then.
Yeah.
And so, where did you get that cardigan? Oh, baby Michael bought it for me. And that she spent all the money that's been, and they were just. And I think we all have known people who.
100%. Yeah. It is just one of those things. It's just, I know it's a cliche, lightning in a bottle or whatever. It is just having that opportunity and the drive and the talent and the ear. And it goes back to what you were saying before. It's the ear, whether it's for creating a character or a voice or writing down a story, a screenplay. That is just something that is just such a gift, isn't it?
Well, really as I say, I know where my limitations are, and where I'm. I think with the ghost stories, I think the people have said to me that it's not been announced yet, so you're getting an exclusive here if anybody cares. People say to me that with my ghost stories, it's the combination of the funny and the macabre. So you get a lot of macabre stories, but I read and some very, very good stories I read as part of a ghost collection that came out last year and the year before, and they were very good, but they weren't funny. And people said to me, that is what you should be doing, because you're combining humor. The thing friends of mine know me for this. I get so frustrated at modern movies, and I see a lot of modern movies because I'm involved in the awards process, voting and all that sort of stuff. So I get to see a lot of stuff, and it's so po-faced, and you just think, where is the humor here? People,
Yes.
human beings have been surviving for 200,000 years by laughing,
Yes.
getting through life with laughter. It's essential.
Yeah.
Part of humanity and at its best on Coronation, and it's almost, I watch all these films and think, where is any humor here? And if it's not there, I think it's almost like if an alien came and watched this movie, they'd think there was no such thing as humor in the world.
Yeah, and without that counterbalance, without that humor, I don't think the heart of things or the drama or the emotion doesn't come across in the same way. It doesn't hit you as hard. Like we were talking about, the royal family is a perfect example. If it wasn't for all those little moments where we get heartwarming, funny moments, and moments where we're like, oh, look at Jim, he's being an idiot or whatever. Later on, when he's just showing his heart, you wouldn't be crying if it wasn't for the humor on the other side of that.
I've fallen out with members of my family, and then Steve, we love you, and it's all hug and all the rest of it. So there's we can all be ourselves. Like I've been an arsehole many a time, like his character, and and all the rest of it, and being lazy and all the rest of it. But there's a real love that's there. It's the one thing about ghosts. I don't know about ghost stories, but
I'm really interested.
The one thing about ghost stories, there aren't many set in a chip shop. I'm
aware of.
I mean, they tend to be. I mean, it's downstairs as the book, so I haven't got it here. But they tend to be E.F. Benson and M.R. James. They tend to be very middle class worlds. And I haven't really found a way of in any of the stories of having a sort of working class background ghost, because it's almost as if the genre doesn't quite modern. Yes, I mean I'm currently writing some stuff about technology. I wanted a very modern technology within the story, and I'm hopefully going to do that. But I haven't actually found a way of. And maybe it's a bit like Midsummer Murders, and the point about Midsummer Murders is it's upper middle class people being miserable, and and people watching their lives thinking, well, I may not have anything, but at least I'm not murdering my best mate, and so it's aspirational in the sense that all the houses in Midsummer Murders, they're all, upper middle class. They're not middle class houses. They're upper middle class. Very aspirational. But God, those people are such bitches and unpleasant. And so maybe there's an element of that in ghost stories, that you want to put the misery onto posh people as much as possible.
So I think like folk horror is interesting, and the further back we go, we find the stories are almost going back to the ground, going back to the people who tend the ground and dig up the ground, and you get more grounded people. But isn't a lot of stories coming from, and I guess you can say that comes from all the characters, accounts and lords and professors.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And so I've got it here. But if I find it. So I read these, and classic ghost stories, mainly Victorian ghost stories. And what's interesting is the servants know there's a ghost. It's actually the posh people that deny there's a ghost, and the locals, the yokels, if you want to call them that, always are aware that the ghost is real.
You don't want to go up to that house.
They're smart. The irony is that they are the smart ones, and it's the idiots that don't that ignore the warning, that then go to the house and then
full of self-importance and
and then and there's I can't remember the names of them, but it's fairly classic that and then you get I sort of write about this. You get the governess position, which is somewhere between the two. You get the servants and the locals and so on that know the ghosts, and the upper class people that don't, and it's often the governess who is somewhere between those roles in the social class, that eventually becomes the ghost seer, or the conduit, so that the ghost is experienced. So I thought that was sort of and actually what's fascinating about ghost stories is there's a huge amount of academia on it, vast amount of academia on it. And so with folk, you talk about folk horror. Where are they in literature then? Where is the folk? How is that different to? How is folk horror different to other?
Well,
horror?
I think in film we talk about. I think when people think about it, they probably talk about Witchfinder General and things like that. Whereas the ones that the British Library have released that are really good, that are like almost anonymous. I think there's one called Stories from the Land, Stories from the Ground, and it's often like about being swallowed up by, you know, the earth opens up and swallows somebody up, and then the woman is looking for her husband. And
because so many of the writers were middle class people like E.F. Benson or M.R. James. And M.R. James often has a sort of yokel character that he slightly makes fun of, because there's malapropisms, which I have granny doing malapropisms, so that's fine. But you know, the comedy comes sometimes from the yokel in M.R. James, who normally comes up with a backstory. You know, they go into the house and the local will tell you, you know, but we'll do it in an entertaining way. So, and I've stolen that from my own M.R. James story. A friend of mine, Adam, who's very good on ghost stories and horror and all that sort of stuff, he comes on stage with me sometimes. And in the bathroom, above the toilet, I have Hattie Jakes.
Oh, fantastic.
And I've got the whole Carry On people. I've got Kenneth Williams, I've got Frankie Howard, I've got Charles Hawtrey, and they're all above the toilet. And he came down. Well, he came downstairs. He came downstairs one day. He said, "You're going to have to move this picture from the wall." I said, "Why?" He said, "I can't go. She keeps looking at me."
Oh wow!
And so anyway, to cut long story short, and I'd had one idea for a ghost story, and the way your brain works, I thought, what can I do with this? What can I do with this idea? You know, I can make the ghost somehow in the picture. So I then came up with a narrative, and so basically I have this narrative where two Carry On fans, who are two gay bears, their downstairs toilet gets haunted by Hattie Jakes.
Oh, brilliant.
So that's the story. So then I thought,
that's Theatre of Blood territory, I feel.
Well,
that's
Theatre of Blood territory. And,
I love it.
And so I then thought, well, who do I get to narrate this? Because I wanted a strong narrator each time. And of course, you see that is when Kenneth Williams comes along. And then I thought, I know what I'll do. I shall write the story in the style of Kenneth Williams. Amazing. So that was one of the very first ghost stories I wrote. It's over 3 years ago now, and the story is called Visiting Hattie, because when Adam comes to stay, he doesn't say, "I'm off to the Lewis, I'm going to visit Hattie." So that's how life.
I feel Kenneth Williams would. I've been reading his diaries, and oh my word, I could never judge if he's going to absolutely hate something or absolutely love it. I think it just depends on what day of the diary.
But I think that's true. I
think he'd love that.
To get into his voice, I got a couple of Kenneth Williams books. I got his autobiography, Just Williams, and I had some of the diaries. And so I also got in touch with Andy Merriman, who'd written the Hattie Jakes biography, and I sent him the story. I was very worried when I sent him the story. I didn't know how he'd react. He loved it. He said it's very funny and very imaginative.
Oh, that sounds great.
So my little collection is it's you know, it's not your normal collection of ghost stories, really.
No, that's for me. I would love to read that, because I feel like I'm circling around to I've done a rewatch of all the Carry-Ons recently. I've watched all the Confessions films again for some reason, and I've watched and I've been reading the, like I say, Kenneth Williams' Diary is massive, like, absolutely massive, and then the letters as well. So I've been really in that world, and I find it such an interesting time capsule. And such an interesting time, and Theatr Blood ties in with that. What people are wearing and the shag pile carpets that are about a foot deep, and all this stuff is just, for me, I feel it's people are coming out a little bit more now and saying, "Oh, I love to hear about that. I love to read about it." There was a re-release of Theatr of Blood that Arrow did, and it just got bought up by people instantly. They were just like, "Oh, it's my favorite. It's my favorite. It's my favorite." And I know there was a play of it.
Well, there's nothing like it, is there? I mean,
No.
I mean, I'm a big fan of some of the certain with James Whale, going back to the 30s, but also the Prince of Darkness, I think, is one of the Hammer horrors. I think it's one of the, I think it's the second Dracula, and I was freaked out by that. And the colours are great, and so on and so forth. But it's there's a great book come out recently, and I'll plug it because it's two friends of mine, Robert Ross and Gemma Ross, and they've written a bestseller now called the Carry On Girls, because it's about the women of the Carry On tradition.
It's on my wish list. Would you believe?
Is it?
Yes. Oh,
it's a wonderful book, and Robert and Gemma know all the ones that are still alive, and Robert particularly knew several of the ones over the years, like he interviewed. He's sort of the Carry On historian, and there is a sort of a growing acceptance now. I think we're coming out of political correctness, that we can go back to watching the Carry-Ons again, and
I agree
and not feel awkward about it, and accept it. I
accept it as it. I certainly think I accept it as it. Like what would we say to watch it and then go and tweak it and change it? It doesn't make sense, because
they have been changed.
That's not what it was.
There's a scene, I think it's in Carry On, Don't Lose Your Head, and it's the corpse. It's a scene between Joan Sims and Charles Hawtrey, and Joan Sims is meant to say, "My husband, the Count."
Oh yes,
but she mispronounces the word count and makes it sound like something else. And you've got this scene where there's a bit of mischief going on. In a recent ITV3 screening, they cut that word.
Oh.
So
all the things they could cut, I mean,
well, you can sort of see why, because it's an offensive word, but
I suppose
it sounds enough like count.
To
get away with it.
I think I heard there was a TV show about Carry On recently, and I'm sure I heard somebody talk about that, but not in the sense of that they cut it recently, but just that it was a kind of funny aside of something that happened. Wouldn't it be funny if they were watching that, the controller of ITV was watching that and going, "Oh, I must watch out for that," and cut it?
Well, I think maybe that's what happened, but you also, I mean, it's everybody who likes the sound of music knows that there is the famous scene where the Mother Abbess, talking about Captain Von Trapp, when Maria returns to the Abbey, and she says, "And what is it, you cunt face, Maria?" And they now have, it's still there in the script, but "what is it, you can't face, Maria?" becomes something else. I did ask a Mother Abbess about that scene, and she said, "We cut the line, and we changed the line so totally that it's gone now." So but you can see the mischief on Joan Sims' face and Charles Hawtrey's corpse, I think, a little bit, when I can't remember exactly what happens in it, but no, somebody, because I'm a member of various Carry On fan groups and stuff, and somebody said, "I watched it on ITV3 and they had cut the word."
It's like leaving Stuart Farquhar's fine, isn't it? Like stupid what?
So my Hattie Jake story is a huge celebration of Hattie Jakes, and there's and the Carry On tradition, which I'm a huge fan of. And actually, what I did in COVID was the first thing I bought in COVID was the collection. And then I spoke to Robert, and I said, I've just bought the collection in a big red box. He said, Are you going to listen to the commentaries? I said, no, I don't think I'm bothered with the commentaries, to be honest. He said, well, I think you should. And I said, why? He said, because I do them all. The book is written with Gemma, or Gemma's really written it, really, and with Robert. It's very much they both have the attitude, but by default, Carry On films are brilliant. So let us not have any arguments about Carry On England and Carry On Emmanuel. They are Carry Ons, and we're not going to argue about whether they're good or bad. So he's very good about it. I like the early ones. I like the early black and white ones, Carry On Teacher, Carry On Cabby. And Carry On Cabby particularly because it was Hattie Jakes' favourite. So I had a great excuse writing that story. So I read Andy's book and then met Andy, and he liked my silly story.
It sounds amazing, the perfect balance of the sort of the silly and the supernatural. Which
it's this. I wanted a really, really, really silly story. The most difficult one I wrote was M.R. James, because I read all the M.R. James stories, and I had a story in mind, and it was terrible. I realized how bad it was. And it wasn't going to work. It was, so, and then slowly another story evolved, which was actually about M.R. James. So that's one particular story. And I was chatting to a friend of mine about the collection, and she said, "Well, you're going to have Thatcher as a ghost, aren't you?" I said, "What? No, I'm not going to have Thatcher as a ghost. Steve, don't be ridiculous. You've got to have Thatcher as a ghost, because that's how you'll market the book." And so I thought, well, right, well, I'll. So I came up with the idea of Mrs. Thatcher coming back as a ghost, trapped.
I thought you were going to say that she'd be almost in a meta-textual way haunting you, and not wanting to write a story about her, but having to write a story about her.
And I had the idea of that Mrs. Thatcher's haunting Downing Street, but I also then thought that all the prime ministers should haunt Downing Street. They should all somehow have a presence there. So then I read this book on all the prime ministers, from Walpole basically onwards, and that was fascinating. That was weeks of work, because so here's the most interesting fact about Wellington: he was the last prime minister to arrive in Downing Street on his horse. So they've arrived in cars ever since, but that gives you a sense of how old the place is. And then I sent it to some political journalists I know, and I said, does this make sense? Have I got it right and stuff? So they were fine about where the cabinet room was, where the private studies were, where certain bedrooms that Churchill slept in had now become sort of rooms where officials gather and all the rest of it. So there's different entertainment rooms, and then there's the garden rooms where the secretaries are. So I got I eventually created a sort of a layout in my own head.
Right, that's interesting.
As to where it's because I wanted it to be accurate. So when Mrs. Thatcher said, "Oh, we turn right here and we go into this room," that is the and next to the cabinet room there's a toilet. So I've slightly invented this, that you could hear the flusher going. just round the corner is a little toilet. So
that's a lovely little detail, because you can imagine people just having to speak up a little bit just to mask the sound.
So and also it was built on swampland. And it was badly built, and in the 1970s it had to be completely overhauled, because it was basically it cost millions to get it fixed. So anyway, so the point of all that was that just for that one line about Wellington arriving on his horse, you have to read lots and lots of books. So
Yes.
that's why I enjoyed that, though. I enjoyed reading about the the different. The book that Ian Dale did was he got historians to write a different chapter on each prime minister that they were expert on. So it's not. I didn't read 200 books, but it was fascinating, and I just enjoyed. And that's the other. I enjoy the research. I enjoy the.
Yeah.
And so I think I enjoyed the Carry On research more than I enjoyed the Downing Street.
Yes, I think I would be. I'd probably be lean to that.
I love, but I also enjoyed reading all the M.R. James stories, and just living in them for a while. And he's a great writer, and
I would love to read that. I'd love to any version, and finished, unfinished, published, unpublished. I'm really interested in reading your horror, because I just like you said, I think with humor comes heart, and
well, I'll do a deal. I'll do it. I'll send you my Hattie Jake story, and on the for your eyes only, as Bond would say, and I'll also send you my screenplay, and maybe later in the year, if the books are ever published, we can have another chat purely about ghosts. In fact, we've talked more about ghost stories than we have about time travel.
I think we have, and I didn't, and I wasn't even. I can't be blamed for leading with that one, because I'm always leaning towards horror. And
I'll send you. No, I'm happy to send you the Visiting Hattie, and also the script. The screenplay is weird because it's a black comedy. It's not as good, frankly, as the Poodles and all the rest of it in Theatre of Blood, but it's got a macabre aspect. And
the poodle side of it is the one bit I struggle with, because I'm fine with anything happening to human beings, but as soon as anything happens to an animal, I'm usually out. So it shows you the quality of Theatre of Blood. I still love it.
Well, he loved that. He loved. Yes, it's one of the classics.
It's cartoony, though, isn't it?
It's one of the great classics. But anyway, I mean, it's a very dark comedy, and I probably less comedy than I think it of it now. I think it's more, but actually, it's without spoiling it for you. It's very much based on my schooling, because I came from a very Catholic background, and when we were having our first communion, we had to do confession and communion, and the teacher would say that if you go to confession and then communion, you are in a state of perfect grace. So that's a good time to die. If you leave the church and then get run over by a bus, you'll go straight to heaven, because you're in a state of. I'm slightly.
No, but I get the point.
Simplifying it. I used to think. So I thought, well, hang on. Supposing I go to confession, supposing I go to communion, and then I sort of trip up on the stairs on the way down and go, oh, bugger. I'm no longer in a state of grace because I've said, oh, bugger, or, oh, Jesus would be even worse, because you're definitely not in a state of grace. Yeah. And then I got run over by a bus. So then I would have to spend, a century in purgatory, because I
just... tightrope. That tightrope over.
Well, time and everything. So this is how my mind works. So I came up with an image, and maybe you can tell me, because I asked my friend Adam, and I said, has this been used in a horror film? He said, well, tell me what the image is. I said, well, it's a beach. There's a slumber party going on a beach, and then a severed head gets washed up, and that's sort of the beginning of a story. He said, I don't think so.
I don't think so. Maybe I'm thinking of there's Nightmare Beach, but I don't. That's an Italian one. There's
a thing called Blood Beach, which is where people get killed. Somebody sent me that this morning, because they're reading the scripts, and they sent me this morning. So
there's a similar thing, but it's not a head as much as somebody buried in the sand within a part of Creepshow, the George Romero, Stephen King, which I think it's Ted Danson, isn't it? Or his head is in, I think, but that's not quite the same.
Well,
So no, I think you're clear.
I think I'm clear. Well, it's so that was the image that came in my head, was a head being washed up on the beach.
Well, certainly a British beach is a completely different sensibility, isn't it?
Yeah. So then I these people on the beach, why are they there? Then you come up with the reason why they're there, and then you want a twist at the end, so you come up with a twist at the end, and then the rest of the movie or the rest of the story is basically the ways those people get killed, and finding and understanding. So then I had to think of ways, not only ways that they died, but why they died in that way. And that's really what the story is why do they die in that way? And then during the whole process, I remembered what my teacher had said about perfect grace. So that's not spoiling it for you, but that gives you the background for it. So
that's really fascinating, that idea, because obviously from those two important ceremonies, or two important things that happen, anything can happen in between those, and it's almost a perfect encapsulation of what Catholicism was kind of saying, essentially, which is what that tightrope between those two events, which is literally balance and don't fall off that piece of string.
Well, we do fall off, and that's why it's so unfair. And
yes, because you're bound to at some point.
You're bound to at some stage, and because we're imperfect. But you had this moment of opportunity where you could die and go straight to heaven. The
best thing that you can do is die. Like
this is when I began to doubt the whole thing and the whole process. But it's that. It's the unfairness of it, and the unfairness of cruelty as well, and stuff. So it's certainly my weirdest story. And even Adam, when I told him about one of the scenes in it, he said to me, "Are you all right, Steve? Are you feeling okay?" I said, "Has this ever been in a film before?" He said, "No, and there's probably a sort of a good reason why it's never been in a film before." I said, "What do you think? It's funny?" He said, "Well." So anyway, I'll send it off, and
oh man,
your feedback would be welcome.
I love it. I'd love it. Just a big thank you for all of your time, and we've covered so much ground, and I've found it so pleasurable. I'm not exaggerating when I say that, you were massively influential on me as a young man, as an only child, staring in the mirror, trying to say certain voices. To then read your books and enjoy them so much is an absolute joy. So thank you so much, Steve.
Well, thank you. And it's an ongoing process. I'm still learning, and I'm still trying to get it to be as good as it can possibly be, and I get into trouble for that sometimes, but I just but no, that's what I want to do. And so anyway, we'll do this again when you've read the stories, and when we haven't even that we're getting close to making it official, but we haven't actually made it official yet. But you've got an exclusive preview on some of the stuff that's happening.